we're having Dan Conlon tonight. Dan is the president of the Russian Honeybee Breeders Association, Inc. And he's going to be speaking about breeding and mechanisms of defense of the Russian honeybees. And some of this is applicable to other bees as well. I've asked Dan to incorporate a bit about the basics of Russian bees into this talk if you can. And because I know not a lot of us know a lot about the Russian bees, but we've heard a lot. The presentation's sponsored by 4 bee clubs: Cumberland County Beekeepers Association, Ray County Beekeepers Association, Roane Morgan Beekeepers Club, and Tennessee Valley Beekeepers Association, of which I'm a member. And Dan, if you will take it from there, we're glad to have you here tonight.
Well, thank you, Chip, and I'm really pleased to be here tonight. I'm sitting in my honey house up here in western Massachusetts, and it was nice and warm. It almost hit 60 today, and now it's down about 32, so the temperature drops pretty quick when the sun goes down. Still got snow on the ground up here, but we're hoping to have a few days when we can actually pop some hives open the next few days. With that said, my wife Bonita and I, we operate Warm Colors Apiary in Western Mass, and we typically will operate with 1,000 hives each season. About 800 are designated to honey production, and the other 200 are part of our queen rearing operation. And we will harvest approximately 30,000 pounds of honey each season. That's our average. And we think of ourselves as basically honey producers, but we also do some pollination locally. We'll do apples and fruit in mid-May, and in the summer we do vine crops, cucumbers, squash. The valley's a big area for that. And we do a little bit of everything associated with bees. But probably what we're known for now really is that we have been working with Russian honeybees for probably 18 years now. And we have seen a lot of changes happen with the bees. And eventually I joined the Russian Honeybee Breeders Association and have been the president. And just to correct Chip, I've been demoted to vice president this year, so I've stepped down from being the main guy. But we're still doing a lot of the same things we've always done. So anyway, I thought I'd talk today about what breeding bees for and do it with the Russian program, and then mechanisms of defense, which is, I think, something any beekeeper should understand some of these things. And I'll do my best. By the way, you're not talking to a researcher or a scientist, so if I get my biology twisted around a little bit, you'll know why. I see myself as a professional beekeeper, and this is how we make our living. I've kept bees since I was 14. Started in Ohio. So I've been doing this for some 55 years anyway, 60 years maybe. Or my wife would say, have you ever done anything else? So anyway, I've got some slides. This is a shot of one of our bee yards. This was one of our early queen yards. And you can see that we were running 3 deeps with these Russians because they to build up so quickly at a certain time of the season. We'll talk about that. What I'll try to do is mix up a little bit of the management of bees as we talk about these mechanisms, because I think for some of you, you're going to probably find that more interesting in some ways. A quick timeline of the Russian honeybee. The first time, this was a response to the varroa mites coming to the U.S. When we got the varroa mites back in the late 90s, we had tracheomites and varroa mites. For those of you who are keeping bees then, it was an awful situation. You could not keep a beehive alive through the winter. It put about 2/3 of the commercial guys out of business, and we haven't fully recovered from that. We once were at about 5 million managed colonies in this country, and the estimates today are still only 2.5 million. So we've never come back for that in the numbers. But anyway, Dr. Rinderer was the director of the Baton Rouge ARS USDA bee lab. And when everyone else was looking for the next chemical to pour on these mites to try to kill them all, he sort of looked at that and he said, that looks kind of like a short-term solution to me. We should be investigating how bees defend against these mites. And he started looking around the world, and they did identify a number of pockets where there were bees that had been, honeybees that had been exposed to these mites for over 100 years and had actually been selected naturally during that time and had ways of controlling the mites or keeping the numbers down. There were mites in these hives, but they had reached sort of a balance where the host and the pest, the pest didn't kill the bees outright. They just coexisted. So he went and found these hives. They brought back samples. I'll cut to the chase here because this could be a long discussion, and I want to save that for the rest of the talk. But they started with 100 queens approximately in 97. They quarantined them on an island in Terre Haute Island in Louisiana, which, by the way, is no longer, after the hurricanes, that island no longer exists now. And then field trials started. The phase 1 was with Hubert Tubbs, Charlie Harper, Manly Bygalt, and these were commercial beekeepers who field tested, and they started selecting. And they started with hundreds of genetic lines. And they basically through phase 1, they did all kinds of mite tests and checks and samples and forever and ever, counting everything they could. And they boiled it down to the 17, 18 genetic breeding lines that they thought were the best choices out of all of those. It took them almost 10 years to do that. And then phase 2 kicked in, and phase 2 is where the Russian Honey Breeders Association comes in. Tom Rinderer had always had this in mind, that the labs would control the process and the breeding selection, but it would eventually be released to the private sector. But before he would release the genetics to us, we had to form a corporation. And in that, with the bylaws, no individual can own the genetics of these bees. Only the association can control it. And that turns out to be a pretty good situation. So to be using the breeding stock that the lab originally started us on, you have to be a member of the organization. There are 17 breeding lines that are separate. Each member is assigned 2 of the 17. And then we would take the other 15 lines. We would get those queens from the other members, and we would raise those as drone producing colonies to mate with our 2 lines. And that's what we try to do. Why mate with the other colonies? Everybody has the same standards they have to meet for mite tolerance and honey production and disease resistance. So we're getting the drones that have that, mating with the queens that have that, and that's going to advance them a lot quicker. So anyway, that's how we got to where we are today. Finding the Russian honeybee, first they had back in 94, they identified sources of mite-tolerant honeybees. And by the way, they went all over the world doing this, and they found a lot of bees that were being claimed as mite-tolerant, weren't really very mite-tolerant. They just didn't have a big problem there yet. But they did find pockets of bees, and these were in the Primorsky Peninsula of Russia, and they had been there they think probably for 120 years, and they were right in the area where the mites were, and the original varroa mites jumped species from the Apis cerana, which is the Asian honeybee, and it was in those parts. And these bees had over time developed the ability to kind of control the mites. So they started using those. They selected those as the one to bring back. We learned how to set up the test yards and ranking. They had to create standards, create tests, including DNA tests. And we use a closed mating system, which basically means in a normal situation, your queens would fly off and go through what we call open mating, where they would mate with whatever drones were in the area from anybody's hives. With a closed system, we are isolating and saturating an area with the drones that we want our queens to mate with, so that we can hopefully step up that natural selection that started in Russia. And we've been able to do that. I'll talk to you about that in a second. The lab created genetic markers, so they can actually do DNA samples off of our bees and determine that they are still have the original genetics in those, and they're compared every year. You have to send your samples in and get recertified, so that we take this very seriously. If you're not certified, you're not allowed to contribute drones to the rest of us until you get your certification back up. And that means sometimes you have to sit a year out and work on your bees. But we have to do that to maintain those standards, and we've been able to increase the standards because of that. And of course, the final thing that had to happen is we have to recruit enough beekeepers to basically handle all these different bees, and that's what we've been doing since 2007. So the selection and certification, two different things. The selection is, what are we looking for as the people raising these bees? Well, we're looking for the mite tolerance first. That's our first assignment. And we do that by taking regular mite samples, but we do not treat those hives. We monitor them. We watch the mite levels, and we track them. And then we look for the best. We will keep a test yard, and I'll show you at the end of this one of my test yards, a flyover. But basically what we're looking for is we might start with 30 to 50 colonies that have one of our breeding lines. And all summer we will be doing things like checking them for viruses, diseases, checking for mite levels at different times, see how the mites develop in these hives, and any other things, how productive they are. And at the end of the season, we will weigh the hives for weight, because we want to know that we want to pick them also for honey production, because we want these to be, as I said, commercially viable. And we send off, we bring in the Beltsville Bee Lab comes and they do spot samples of a lot of our hives too, and they do pretty elaborate breakdowns, including some pesticide tests and wax tests. So from all of that, we end up with the top 10 queens from each line. And the final test is always to send them in for the DNA verification. And those top 10 queens then have to, up here, survive the winter. And in the spring, we will use those to breed next year's queens. As I said earlier, the drone source queens are coming from other certified breeders, and that's who we will try to mate our lines with. Here's an example. I won't spend too much time on this. There's the difference between breeding the queens and rearing queens. There's a lot of really good queen producers. There really are. And this isn't the time at all. But breeding queens, we are deliberately trying to improve certain characteristics. And that's a little different program. I sometimes have people say, can't I just buy all the different lines represented and just have Russian bees? And that would be great, except you don't have the advantage of knowing what we know, because we have the genetic bee lab advising us on what combinations are working best and what we should do next. And when we have a problem, we can sometimes change the mating to some extent and manipulate that characteristic to be either improved or lessened. And the annual probability of assignment, which is what we call the POA, is a DNA test. And what you're looking at, those bars represent different breeding lines. Mine are the YB and the YG. And what you'll see a line across the top, and everything above that has met our standards of purity. So you can see there's some that don't make it. You can see the WP that year. There was only one that just made it to the line. All those other queens were probably excellent queens from the standpoint of the beekeeper, but they didn't pass all the tests that we have to put them through in order to preserve the genetic diversity of these bees. So that's just an idea how that works. In that case, you can see my YBs. Every one of those was well up there, and I even had a couple of 100%ers. Now, since that, because we've gotten better at saturating mating areas, I'm disappointed if I don't see 98% every time or better. So I see 100%ers all the time now, and that's true of a number of the members. So, what are the mechanisms of mite resistance? First of all, you want to understand this. Not one thing works for mites. No, and I would go to say you're always advised, if you're treating for mites, that you should alternate treatments. Don't do the same thing over and over. Do something different. Good advice. And that goes the same with the bees. These bees, we know of at least about 10 different things that the Russian bees use to reduce mite levels. So understand that there's not one thing that they're doing that makes it all work. What they do, all these 10 things, is they sort of mutually support each other, and they add to the resistance. It's kind of like saying, okay, you got 10 things and you get 10% mite reduction off each of them. It's not quite that clean cut, but my point is, yeah, it takes 10 things to make this all work. Natural selection in Russia, we've just picked up on that, and we're just doing artificial selection now. And we're trying to basically enhance the honeybee characteristics that reduce the mites. That's the number one goal. Along with that, we've discovered many other things about these bees, such as the fact that we have not seen a case of American foul brood in these bees, and the lab confirms that. And we also see that they're highly resistant to most diseases, but there are a few we do see sometimes. We will see European foul brood sometimes. We do see the deformed wing virus, which is, of course, associated with the Varroa mites. But all other viruses are very low. They're there in the panels that we get back, the screenings, but they never seem to manifest themselves in any kind of a level that damages the hive. So these bees do show a lot of resistance to not just tolerance to the mites, but also resistance to a lot of the viruses and diseases, which is another real advantage. So even if you have a lot of mites in these bees and you knock the mites back, they do come back quickly, and they don't tend to stay sick. And as I said, some of these effects are really small. Some of these methods of resistance have small effect, but collectively they're strong. And I put this in red: mite-tolerant bees not yet available anywhere. It's a very disturbing to me that I deal with a lot of the researchers, a lot of the people I see as being really good at this, and I would tell you there's not a one of them that would tell you that there's a mite-resistant bee without some assist. It's getting better. With that said, we do have members who skip years. We skip years here. We don't treat at all. We didn't 2 years ago. We didn't treat any, not one hive out of 1,000, and I don't think we really lost any hives to mites that year. And this past year, we had a lot of mites, but the conditions were different, and we managed to knock them down, I think. So anyway, these are the 10 things. Suppression of Varroa growth rate. In other words, Varroa populations do not grow very quickly in Russian colonies, and there's reasons. We'll discuss that in a minute. Russians have a high sensitivity to Varroa, and called Varroa sensitive hygiene. You've heard of VSH. And by the way, the Bee Lab tests all the VHS or VSH queens down there from all kinds of breeders. And so they have a really good understanding of this mechanism. And I would I'll mention this again. The Varroa sensitive hygiene is not hygienic behavior. They're two different things. Hygienic behavior was really associated with American foul brood and the removal of dead brood. And many people would tell you they think it's associated with the smell of dead bees in the comb, and we know some bees are very good at removing that and cleaning those combs out. That's different from being sensitive to Varroa. who are removing live larvae and pupa before they emerge, and the mites that may be on them. And that's a little different. So the Russians have a high hygienic behavior, but they also have varroa sensitive. Bees that have varroa sensitive hygiene do have hygienic behavior, but the reverse is not true. Bees can have hygienic behavior, but not be varroa sensitive. Okay, I hope that's clear. Grooming behavior. Russian bees do two things. First of all, they groom a lot, more than any other bee. And they also do something else called auto grooming, which is grooming themselves. And the researchers don't think that the auto grooming knocks off a lot of mites from each other or from the bee that's doing the grooming, but they think it does signal other bees to come over and assist that bee and pull the mites off of them. So it sort of stimulates the behavior of grooming. And with Russians, that's a huge one because they use it all the time, and they can actually really reduce mite levels in a hive if there's a high level going on. And that's one reason it doesn't get to that point. So reduced mite reproduction. The Russian hives show clearly that mites don't reproduce as well in Russian hives. We'll talk about that. The comb itself works with this extended phoretic period. The comb itself is actually keeps the mites, the reproductive mites, from going into the cells too early. They also seem to be somewhat of a deterrent from the mites laying their eggs, and so there's fewer eggs. I'll explain this right in a second. Fewer eggs in the comb than phoretic mites on the bees a lot of the time. The phoretic mite, by the way, is when the mite first emerges from the cell. It attaches itself to a honeybee and starts feeding on the fats and the hemoglyph, and that's the maturing period. And then eventually they go and they find a cell and they go and lay the eggs right before the cell is capped. So the phoretic period is the mite is still maturing, but it's not reproductive yet. And we know this, the brood is less attractive to the mites. The adult bees in a Russian colony are more attractive, and they actually act as a good magnet to draw the mites to them. And we aren't sure what that's about. I don't think researchers have figured that out. They think it might have to do with certain scents that are in the larvae and pupa, and maybe even the food that is being fed to the larvae. But there's something going on there that pushes the mites or keeps the mites away, and it lowers their infestation. And so they have a lower proportion of infested brood for the number of adult mites you might get. And we've seen this with mite samples. You know, we will do samples of mites, and we've got really high mite numbers, and we'll sort of get into a panic and say, boy, this hive is really in trouble. And so we might do something to knock the mites down, give them some kind of treatment, and before long, everything's back to normal. There's no mite problem. There's no more mites being coming out of the comb, and so that was something we sort of knew. As a field test, we were seeing the beekeepers were seeing this really strange thing where we'd see high adult mites levels, but not that many mites in the cells. And so that lower proportion of infested brood is complemented by the fact that more of these adult mites stay on the adult bees. And there's also fewer mites in each cell as eggs. So you have fewer reproductive female mites developing. And then there's the timing of the brood. You've probably heard that interrupting the brood pattern is a way to control mites. Well, it's true. It does two things. With Russians in the spring, they build up very slowly. And of course, what do mites need? They need brood in order to increase their population. So if there's little brood in the Russian hive in the spring, that means the overwintered mites that have been with them are not getting a good foothold to really lay that many eggs. And then once the fresh pollen and nectar come in, the Russians start laying eggs like crazy, and that's where they get reputations swarming a lot, because they get these explosive populations. But they are getting mainly healthy bees because there's not that many mites to go in and lay eggs on their developing brood. So that's part of that. The other thing that happens with them is up here in July. I don't know how it is in Tennessee, but in July in Massachusetts, we often have a nectar dearth. Now, when I used to have Italian bees, the Italian bees would keep raising sort of a steady brood production right in through the season, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And with the Russians, though, once there's a dearth, they'll do a couple of things. If there's very little food out there, they will just shut down and stop laying eggs altogether, or cut back on eggs. But they also do another thing. They will go in and cannibalize the brood and remove it from the cells, along with any developing mites. So they actually will clean out those comb during that period. And remember the grooming. During that time, the other bees that are in the hive, because they aren't foraging, because we don't see a lot of forage out there, are now full tilt grooming. So they're reducing mites that way during this period. And if this goes on for a few weeks, your hive can come out of that in very good condition, and you haven't yet had to do any kind of a treatment on that hive. So those are the things that they do. A little more detail. There's a good looking Russian queen there. We see all kinds of colors, by the way, on these bees. We see some that are light. My two lines, one of them is very dark, like this one. Only the body itself is even darker than that, and it has kind of cream stripes. And then my other line has looks a lot more Italian to me, except that they also have a little different color striping than Italians. So when you look at them closely, you realize they aren't. But we see all kinds of shades. We see some that are just jet black and look like carniolans. We see just a lot of mixes. And by the way, genetically, probably these bees are, in their distant past, probably connected to carniolans and bees like that. So these are not a specific race of honeybees. These are a product of selection, isolation in the Primorsky region, and now continued isolation in our breeding program. So they've sort of evolved as their own kind of bee, but they aren't a particular race. So the Russians have a smaller mite growth rate, and and by the way, I would suggest all of you who have a real interest in this, buy Tom Rinderer's book that came out this year called The Russian Honeybee. Dr. Rinderer, it's a very educational book. You will learn more about bees. He cites all the studies, all the research. It's all right there. So you don't have to take my word for anything I'm saying. Just go get that book, and it's all in front of you. Anyway, you will learn a great deal about all this stuff. Anyway, the Russian Honey Breeders Association we've improved stock since 2007. The Bee Lab tells us how good we're doing or how bad when we meet once a year, usually down there. And we review how everybody's stocks. We all have to send in reports from different parts of the country, and it all goes there, and it goes to our secretary, and we decide which release lines, meaning which bees are we going to release to the public, and which bee lines are doing well, and what are the specific advantages. Anyway, Russians have showed a consistent downward trend in mite population growth since 2007. It's not always an even thing every year. Excuse me. We've had setbacks, and it's incremental. It's a little bit at a time. This is not something that one year we think we're going to just kind of wake up one year and have the perfect bees. This is a long haul program that if it's kept up for 20 years, 30 years, we will see really positive results. But there's also a fair amount of maintaining the genetics and the lines, and that's our job as the holders of these genetics. Varroa sensitive hygiene, as I mentioned, it's not the same as hygienic behavior. I'm sorry, by the way, for all this wordiness in my slides, but as you can imagine, I'm trying to keep these things all separate in my head so I explain them to you the right way. I always joke when I'm in the bee lab that I have to bring a dictionary because these guys throw around a lot of terms you just don't hear on the street too often, or even among other beekeepers. So I'm always checking to see, what did he just say? So I'm trying to say it to everybody in terms we all understand as beekeepers. So they're probably equal in VSH to other bees that also are known to have high levels of VSH, but they also have other things going for them. The VSH is a part of it where they can go in and pull you can see this picture, you can see a mite right on that bee. They're taking that out of the cell, and they will get rid of that whole thing. And if the mite happens, and by the way, a lot of times when bees open these cells, the mites run out before they've fully developed, and those mites, for some reason, tend not to be reproductive if that happens, if they're prematurely released. In other words, they must not have developed fully somehow. And with the Russians, by the way, that's another one of those things we don't quite understand, except that we know that 50% of the adult bees that you find in the population, in the colony population, are non-reproductive. In other words, 50% of the female mites can't reproduce and don't. So that's another huge difference. This hygienic behavior we talked about a little bit. It's not VHS or VSH. I'll get that right one of these times. When they were tested, showed that Russians had 41% of Russian colonies will remove above 95% of dead brood. That means they'll uncap it and they'll remove it from the hive. With Italians, it's about half of that, about 21%. So the Russians are very good at that part too, the hygienic behavior, and not just with the mites. And I mentioned that the Varroa sensitive hygiene is exhibited. If you have bees that have that, they're probably also hygienic as far as general hygienic behavior, but it isn't in reverse. You can have bees with hygienic behavior, but they may not have Varroa sensitive hygiene. And another thing I just thought I'd mention is with this Varroa sensitive hygiene, if any of you have been experimenting with some of those queens, you can select for that to the point where they will remove half of your brood. And I've seen that at the bee lab with some of the experiments they've done down there. You will pull out a nice capped frame of brood and it will be just full of holes, and you'll go, what's wrong with this hive? And the researcher will explain to you, well, that's because that bee has such highly developed behavior as far as hygienic and Varroa sensitive. They just take they take everything out of the brood, so you can actually overdo it, have them be too good at it. Grooming behavior, it's a physical removal of mites. The auto grooming is when the bee removes mites from its own body. I wanted to mention mite biters. Mite biters get a lot of press in the past couple of years. Well, the Russians are the top of that pyramid. About 42% of Russians showed that they physically damage mites, compared to the best Italians at 28%. And by the way, sticky board counts they use for that. So, but here's the thing I wanted you to know. Tom Rinderer and many of the researchers at the lab will tell you this. They don't necessarily think that finding an increased number of injured mites is an indication of increased mite resistance. It might just be the housekeeping of dead mites, because what they also noticed was that lots of mites are dried up, desiccated. They have no moisture left, which makes them very brittle, and they damage easily. So any kind of movement is going to damage these mites. So there's there's not a lot of support that measuring mite injury, it correlates with better mite control. So they may change their minds on that, but a couple of them have expressed that to me, and they're people who study this stuff, so I think they have a good idea what's going on with that. And one of the things they did do, and by the way, they counted, imagine this, for one of the things I've learned about research is that it's a tedious job. It's a lot of work. Some of the experiments they do at the lab, I am just amazed, because they will take an entire hive and count every bee, every mite, and everything about it, and spend 4 hours with 4 researchers documenting every detail. And then the woman who puts the data onto the computer, it'll take her an hour and a half just to type it in. And they were ambitious. They were going to do this with 100 hives. But from that, they actually counted every type of injury on every mite they'll find, and every condition, the age of the mites. But here's one of the things I thought was interesting. First of all, the varroa sensitive hygiene and grooming, they are connected, because if there's mites that are escaped when the cells are open, the grooming actually helps, because the bees are going to pull mites off of other bees, and that's going to help lower that. But here's what they found with the research. If you see a lot of old mites and a lot of young mites, that's a good indication that you've got a lot of that, both those things going on. That is an indication that you probably have a hive that's very good at lowering the levels of mites. Reduced mite reproduction, foundress mites, which are the mothers, they go in and lay the eggs. The foundress mites produce 1.5 or 3 times in a season. And we refer to those reproductive cycles. If you're in the South, you guys probably aren't far enough south, but if you get down to where it's really warm a lot of the year, they might do mites might do 4 cycles, and each cycle can make the hive worse and worse, because you're going to keep spreading, they're going to keep developing. So with the Russian cells, they always found lower numbers by 0.3 or so. So the number of female mites, and the way the foundress lays eggs is she lays a male egg first, and then she'll lay a couple, 2 or 3 female eggs, and of course they're the ones, they end up mating with their brother basically, and so there's an inbred thing going on with mites. And obviously mites are immune to inbreeding, or we would see some other things happening. But anyway, it lowers the number of females per infested cell, and that of course turns around and lowers the number of potential reproductive mites in the long run. The comb, here's a little more about that, the foundress. Italians averaged 3.3, including the males. So that would be a male and 2.3 females, which means nothing except that, 2 or 3 females. The Russians would average about 3. The viable daughters, meaning that in the Italian hives, would be between 1.2. And that's when I say viable daughters, those are the ones that actually are properly mated and can then reproduce later. With the Russians, they tend to have less than 3 three mites in a cell, and they have fewer than one viable daughter. And that doesn't sound like much, but it's in part over time with these mites. Each one is going to, if they do 4 cycles, they're going to create another, who knows, another 10 or more, progeny to go on and lay another round. Now you have 10 laying another 10 and so forth, and it balloons. So even a couple fewer is going to slow things down. And the comb on Russian cocoons, now we mentioned this, we think they may have chemicals from larvae, pupa, and brood food that inhibit the mite reproduction. We see that happening pretty much.
Country has an incredible music history all of its own because everybody that's in here.
The percentage of non-reproductive mites in Russians is about 50%. So that's a good amount of the mites that aren't going to reproduce. Extended phoretic period, we talked about that a little bit. Phoretic periods right after the mature mite comes out of the cell and attaches itself to the bee. And because they are out longer, 2 things happen. They might lose a whole cycle of reproduction because they're out longer, but they also are at a disadvantage because they're more likely to be groomed from the host bee. So that's always important too. So that's happening. And we find that the phoretic mites are higher in Russian colonies in proportion in the number, but the total number of mites is generally lower. Okay, so what we're really comparing here is that, as I said earlier, you might have more mites on the adult bees than in the brood, and that's what we see fairly consistently. And that total number of mites on the adult bees is still much lower than what you might see in other hives. And as the cycles go, typically with Italians, you will have so many mites in the spring, more a month later, even more and more a month after that. And by August, you've got a hive that might crash on you from the mite loads. With the Russians, they never get like that. They actually dwindle back and forth, and they tend to stay a little more even. They do increase, so don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you won't have mites. It's just that there's plenty of times you can get to winter without treatments. And the brood is less attractive to mites, which I find to be really interesting. Drone brood is the most attractive, and it's even more attractive than worker brood. So drone trapping, some of you remember that, and maybe some of you use it, really works well with Russians. And by the way, this is, and I have down the end, this is typical of Apis cerana colonies. These Russian bees are actually doing the same thing that the Apis cerana colonies, that's the Asian honeybee where these mites originated. And the difference is the Asian honeybees, the only brood that the mites go for on the Asian honeybees is the drone brood. They don't even attack the worker brood. And the Apis cerana will remove that drone brood. And during swarm season and so forth, they raise so many drones that they still have enough drones in the air to do the mating and all the rest. However, this is the behavior we see in these Russian bees. Certainly not to the extent that the Apis cerana are exhibiting it, but it's certainly an important thing to sort of see that this is kind of a bee thing. They're kind of social bees are sort of operating in similar patterns, even though they're different species. And anyway, I've said this a number of times. The Russians do show higher mite levels and fewer mites in the brood, but that's really, if you think about it, we worry about our bees being fed on by mites, but where they do the most damage is in the worker brood. If the worker brood is unhealthy with the viruses, if they're damaged with deformed wing virus and other things, that's hard to come back from. There's also a lower proportion of the brood becomes infested. And this is all something you would probably assume anyway, but they have less infestation. I put this picture up because when we are looking at our hives, now in the old days before the mites, you used to sort of judge a queen and say you wanted a totally solid pattern on a brood frame like this. But we have since learned that about 10% full of holes is a good sign. That means you've got that hygienic behavior and that VSH probably going on. And you can get a good indication as to how well you're doing by these holes. Oh, by the way, I meant to mention when I talked about the dearth and the bees cannibalizing brood and removing mites from the cells, sometimes that gets confused. Even the bee inspectors up here, we had to show them because they looked at some, because you get this shotgun brood pattern going. It looks like it might be a disease or some illness in the hive. And we had to do lab samples and all kinds of things to convince them that no, this is something that happens. But with the Russians, once that's over and the next bloom comes in, which for us is usually the start of the goldenrod run in August, and just as soon as that starts up, you start getting these full frames laid again. It just comes right back. So, but if you're not used to that, you start seeing these things and you wonder what you're looking at. So if you decide to get some Russian bees, you're going to want to learn a few of these things because they do behave somewhat differently. Anyway, we talked about this, the fewer mites per infested cell. And the outbreeding. Well, one of the things with Russians is, of course, there is no outcrossing of the mites because they hardly ever have more than one foundress, one laying mite in a cell, where Italians often will get several, which means there'll be two males which can then outcross in their breeding with the females that are in there, which does sort of improve the diversity of genetics they have. Anyway, I mentioned the reproductive cycles. Russians had low over the same periods. They tested 100 Italian hives and the other thing. And the final thing that I want to spend a minute on is the timing of the brood production. The brood is, of course, the resource mites use to expand their populations. If there's no brood, the mites can't grow. Simple as that. And we talked about the early brood in the spring allows for early mite increase. However, with the Russians, they don't build up quickly. They need fresh pollen and nectar. And what we have found is we do look for dandelion season. When the dandelions kick in, it seems like that's when the queens really start kicking in. Now, the other thing I would tell you though is I think that the Russians in the winter go longer without laying than maybe the Italians do. I mean, it's typical up here for the queens to start laying in late February, and there'll be small brood patterns, but they'll slowly get bigger and bigger. But with the Russians, that brood pattern kind of stays the same size, it seems. And we've done a few times where we've checked, not a lot of hives, but we've kind of looked at them enough to get a sense of what's going on with them. But we will then send out these bees to apple pollination mid-May. And that's usually when we've also got the dandelions starting. And I'll tell you what, when you bring those after 10 days in the orchard, getting a good dose of apple pollen and nectar, and dandelions, because they're getting a lot of that too. We call it apple honey, but it's got plenty of dandelion in there too. Anyway, we will see literally frame after frame of eggs. They just have so many eggs. And of course, we know 3 weeks later, those are all going to be bees. So one of the first things we do is we start looking at how many frames we're going to redistribute and start nukes with and things like that, because a month from then you're going to have swarms. And we know that's going to happen next unless we do that. So one of the things, if you're using Russians and you see the buildup happening, you should just, decide you're going to have another beehive and pull a few frames of that brood out, put a queen on it, maybe let them raise a queen if the conditions are ready, and just do that. Because if you don't, you will have a swarm and you'll lose half your bees. So just be proactive on that. That's been our best solution to swarming, by the way. And there are years, by the way, that at the end of June, we will be sitting on literally 300 or 400 nukes that we've created simply by removing brood to keep the populations down. So the midsummer dearth, that's when the queens will slow and stop laying. If you're running a Russian colony, be aware that happens. Russian bees are totally tuned into their environment for fresh food. If it's coming in, they gear up and lay eggs and build up brood quickly. And when they don't have any food coming in, they shut down and they don't overtax themselves. Tom Rinder always used to say to us, where they come from in Primorsky region, you got a small window of opportunity to multiply and send out a swarm. So these bees are always ready to build up quickly and to shut down so they conserve their resources. The other thing I would caution you to do with Russians is know this: Russian bees in the good weather have queen cups all summer. So for those of you who see that as a sign of them superseding or raising a swarm or emergency queen production, know this: they also tear those down and build them again and tear them down. So you can't really go by that. You have to kind of look in for the royal jelly and see if there's a larvae in there, and that's when they're going for sure. So the brood interruption, you can use that to your effect, and you could probably to some extent use it with Italian colonies. But what we will do a lot of times is after we've pulled the June honey or got through the June honey flow, that's a good time to do splits. And it's also a good time to do this process. And we will sometimes, if you're putting a queen cell in, by the time that queen cell hatches out and mates and she starts laying, this brood interruption process will have already played out, and you will have gotten the benefit of that grooming and getting rid of the mites on the adults. And then for the queen, that's the mother queen, you can always just cage her for 2 weeks and let the brood run out and let them clean things up, and then release her and let her start laying again. But either way, you can do that. And if if your hives don't have a lot of mites already, that'll be enough really for the season in most cases. So anyway, a little more. You're looking at an overview. That's our apiary. We have an 80-acre apiary, and you can see it's a mixed habitat. That in the foreground, that's a test yard. On one side, I have one of my genetic lines, and on the other side, I have the other line. And down the middle, we will put in drone source bees. You can't quite tell, but we do have a pretty substantial electric fence around that because we are in bear country. We have lots of bears here, and they do quite a job on your bees when they get into the fences. So that's one of the extra things we have to do, is we have to keep the grass cut around the electric fences and do a lot of maintenance, which is, I don't mind the bears. I just wish they'd leave my bees alone. The habitat here, you can see we're in a valley. There's where this was taken was, and this was done with a drone camera flyover. But there's mountains on the other side of the valley, and where this drone is on the mountains on our side. And we have plenty of water. We have forage from early spring until late fall, so it's a really good place for bees to do pretty well most of the time. They get a lot of natural forage. They get a lot of variety in their forage. We do have some agriculture that's up over the tree line, you can see. Usually, we don't see a lot of pesticide issues. In 20 years of doing pollination, I think we've only had a couple of small incidences with a couple of hives, and those were just accidental. The farmers are pretty conscientious about not messing with the bees, and they're paying me to put bees out there, so they don't want to be charged for dead bees either. So we haven't had a lot of problem with the farms. The future of the Russian Honeybee Breeders Association is that we're still together, we're still carrying on. Our mission continues to be to maintain the genetic diversity of these Russian bees, which, by the way, have some of the most diverse genetics of bees that are currently available in this country. We haven't, as you know, been able to bring in new replacement sources of genetics for a long time, since 1922, other than with drone semen and things like that. So the Russian is really the newest introduction to this country. And as Dr. Rinder likes to say, we haven't managed these bees long enough to mess them up. So they've got all their natural genetics still intact. The other thing is we're going to continue to select for the desirable characteristics. And by the way, we don't need to know all these things are happening with our bees all the time. What we do know, though, is if we are measuring the mite levels, it gives us an idea of who's doing well with this. And the other thing with the honey, people say, well, you can't really select for honey, can you? Well, you don't really look at it that way. We look at honey as an indicator of good health, because hives that have large honey production tend to be pretty healthy hives. And up here, your biggest honey producers are your overwintered colonies. And in first year colonies, you might get some honey, but you can't really expect it till the second season. So these are sort of measurements that make sense without having to know everything. As people will up here, when I've shown people how to raise queens, they always say, oh, well, how do I run all these tests and do these things? And I always say to them, you don't really even need to know that. If those queens and those hives are alive in the spring, they probably got what we want. You want a hive that's going to basically be able to survive the winters and live through the season. And, if you're measuring your mites and taking care of your mites, generally things go pretty well. Probably our biggest obstacle for the association is membership. We really do need more members. And unfortunately, it's a group that has certain prerequisites that are not easy for everyone to meet, such as you have to have a minimum of 200 colonies. They have to be Russian-headed. In other words, they have to have Russian queens in all of them. And the reason for that is we know that if you run mixed yards, then the mite counts will escalate. They will go up. And that's even with the Russian hives. If you have just Russian hives, Russians tend not to rob as often, so there's less robbing, and they tend to all keep the levels down in the first place, so there's not mites migrating around the yard quite as much. So we need people who know something about raising queens before they come into the program, because we're not really we're not a place that we teach you to raise queens. Everybody in our group is an experienced queen breeder, and we certainly help each other and give each other tips. And I'm not saying that isn't happening, but it makes it a little difficult for a new person to break in. You sort of need to do somewhat of an apprenticeship, I guess you'd call it, where you work with one of us until you kind of get to the point where you can handle it on your own. I've got one person that I've been doing that with up here, and hopefully there'll be some others that take an interest in it. But the membership is one of those things we're seeing. We get criticized sometimes for not having the bees to sell. That's a legitimate criticism. There aren't a lot of people in our membership who are raising surplus bees to sell. Probably half of our members aren't in it for bee sales whatsoever. They're in it for the development of better bees that are mite tolerant. But we do have some commercial size operations that do sell queens, and they'll sell nukes, and the Coys in Mississippi will even sell packages. I think they supply all of Kelly's packages and Man Lake's queens, they're Russian queens. So if you're interested, I'm going to put this last slide up. These are some places you can get some more information. That's Tom's book. Stephen Coy, also one of our members, contributed to it too, so his name's on there as well. I think you can order it through Amazon. Go to the Bee Lab, and I would encourage everybody to utilize the Bee Lab, and particularly go to where they list all of their publications. These are free. Most of these things are free, and they have some tremendous research on not just Russian bees, but all kinds of bees, all kinds of studies, experiments, even things like, is an 8 frame better than a 10 frame? I mean, they've even done those experiments to see if they could see whether bees develop quicker in those. So there's just all kinds of information there, and it's done under very good scientific process. So it's reliable information. And then we have our RussianHoneyBreeders.org. That's our organizations. And if you're looking for somebody who might be looking to sell bees or buy bees from, you can look up and see where the different members are located and give them a call or send them an email. And then there's our warmcolorsapiary.com. I have a lot of information on there. Take a look at it, take a visit, and you'll see what we're all about. And I think at that point, I don't know how much time I took, but if you got some questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Yes, if you want to enter questions into the chat box, we will pass those on along to Dan. Tom, just for your information, it appears the Facebook simulcast has ceased. I don't know what you might could do to start that back. I had a couple questions. You mentioned during before we really got started, you were talking about running your hives with 3 deeps. And
yeah.
Is that an indication that the Russians need more space, or is it to handle that fast buildup?
Yeah, those particular hives I was showing you, I was kind of bragging on that they were really great brood producers. I would tell you this: the Russians are often accused of being too swarmy, but the reason they're too swarmy is that rapid buildup. And until you see it, by the way, people never quite imagine how quickly that can be. But let me give you an example. When we bring bees out of apples, they go in with a lot of empty comb, and we put an empty super on top to hopefully get some apple honey. And those bees will often go in 1 deep and a medium on top. And when they come out, sometimes there's hardly any room for the honey for the eggs. They went up in 10 days. So this queen went from 0 to 1,000 a day. I don't know what she was laying, but we see that all the time. And then what will happen, as I said earlier, 3 weeks later, you got that many new bees coming out. You're going to start seeing that. And as soon as that happens, if you're not paying attention, they go right into swarm mode. They are ready. So when you ask, do they need more space? Yes, they do. And it needs to be in the form of drawn comb. Drawn empty comb is what Russians benefit from. If you got a bunch of foundation in there, they will work it, but that's not going to necessarily keep them from swarming if you're really jammed up. So I would say, yeah, keep 2 deeps on them, and keep honey supers going too. So
interesting. Another thing you mentioned was in the dearth how they stop laying, and of course that would be a good time for oxalic acid treatments. But what you're saying is they kind of do it for you with their picking up the brood and everything. I was wondering, is there any way you can stimulate a flow with, say, sugar water and pollen substitute to keep them laying, or do they recognize it?
Yeah. That's a good question, Chip. Yeah, you know what I was using last summer? I was experimenting. I used some of that Man Lake syrup. What do they call it? I must have a bucket in here somewhere. Anyway, it's a combination of fructose, glucose, and sucrose. And what I was doing was I was cutting it with water and putting it in frame feeders. And they brewed it up really nice on that stuff. It seemed to stimulate them, and they came right back. So, I will probably, the stuff's very expensive. That's the one thing I didn't like about it, but I'm cheap. I'm kind of cheap. So, anyway, you can do that. I would tell you this too. One thing we do, and we've done this for a long time. And part of it is that I don't know, you're familiar with the idea of P450 enzymes in bees? P450 enzymes. I heard this down at Gulfport at one of their state meetings I was asked to talk at. And that one of the head toxicologists from the bee lab was given this thing, and he had basically shown how different pesticides affected the different bees, different races of bees. And at one point he put the Russians up there, and he said, oh, the Russians they could take 70% neonicotinoids, ingest them, and they would survive. And I thought, well, that's impossible. Isn't it impossible? So afterwards I got to talking to him, and he says, you don't get it, Dan. The reason that works is that this is about P450 enzymes. Humans have it. Our liver produces it. It causes you to be able to break down toxins in your body and then excrete it. So the bees do the same exact thing. However, this is what happens with bees, and this is why he said, with the Russians, you guys tend to use real pollen for feed, and you tend to leave honey on for them. You tend to do that. So you're giving them honey and pollen, and here's the thing. When a bee emerges from the cell, it has to get certain enzymes from nectar and pollen that trigger the production of P450s in their body. And if that doesn't happen in the first 2 days of life, then it doesn't happen very well. So now what you have is a bee that can't detoxify its system, shorter lifespan, and there's all kinds of toxins out there for bees to collect in their bodies. So after talking to him, we kind of switched some of our plan, and we started basically taking, pollen substitute, but we trap pollen every season and freeze it, and then we will pound it into the patties, and that also broods them up really nicely. So giving them some real pollen, say out of the freezer, so it doesn't lose its nutritional content too quickly, that would be worth doing too. And both of those things do work for these bees. So you can feed them and get some results. And I think a lot of the commercial guys are probably using corn syrup on them, and they seem to get some results. I think for the beekeeper who's operating a smaller number of hives, you can do these extra steps to help keep the healthier bees and avoid them having other kinds of issues. And I think nutrition is one of those things beekeepers need to spend more time paying attention to. We've been raising bees since the 70s on corn syrup. And you know what? That's like growing up on Wonder Bread, It only goes so far. And I don't know, you ever meet a guy, Gordon Wardell? He was with the USDA for years, and he used to always talk about, I remember him giving a lecture on, he studied bee nutrition with the bee lab in Tucson, I think. And he would say, when you have a malnourished bee feeding and producing brood food with basically no good nutrition, then you have another generation of malnourished bees, and it just continues and continues. And I always took that to heart. And I think as a beekeeper, we all need to pay attention to what our bees are taking in, and don't get too greedy on the honey, taking the honey. Don't get too greedy. You know, I know guys that'll strip all the honey out and feed them syrup for the winter. They also have a high level of replacement bees in the spring.
I can imagine. But Dr. Renderer's book that Dan referred to is available at coybeecompany.com. Stephen Coy is co-author. And we like doing business with small business. It is available on Amazon. I think it's the same price, but maybe you have to pay shipping from Coy Bee Company. So if you will, check out that Coy Bee Company. Because we see Russian queens offered from various breeders. What percentage of those breeders are producing queens that reflect selective breeding for the characteristics of mite resistance that you described? Would that be most all of them? I guess any association member would be.
Well, if they're an association member, the question is there, here is how we view this. And we don't even give you a pass in our own organization unless you're doing the work. So you need to ask, are you a certified apiary? Because when you're certified, we're not certifying the bee, we're certifying the apiary as having the ability to produce the bee within our guidelines and our standards. And you don't get that without doing all the work that leads up to that certification. You know, it took me 2 years to get certified when I joined this organization. You know, but you know, I was kind of, I shouldn't tell that story, but you know, I go to the first meeting and they assigned me the two lines that were almost extinct. And I'm going, what's putting that on the new guy? Oh, I don't want to be the guy who goes down in history as the guy who loses the 2 lines, you know? And the other thing, oh yeah, but you can't be certified, Dan, until you have replaced all your 1,000 hives with pure Russian queens. And of course, you know, that means you have to raise all the queens. So I said, this is, you know, like a catch-22. How do you do that? You got to be going in circles. I don't have the queens to get certified, and I can't get the testing until I'm completely Russian. So anyway, one reason I wanted to be president, by the way, have a little more say in some of this stuff. You know how that goes, right?
Right.
South Deerfield, it's we're a couple miles west of the Connecticut River, so we're not hard to find. We're actually, unlike what a lot of you guys have never been up here to the Massachusetts area. We aren't all pavement and hardtop like Boston. We got a little bit out in the western part of the state. A lot of woods, a lot of wildlife.
A lot of bears.
Lots of bears, yeah. You know, my bee yard, that one I showed you guys, I had a pair of bobcats living right out there with me all summer, and I got to see them raise their 3 youngins, and they got really tame after a while. They didn't. I guess they see you in a bee suit, they don't think you're human or something. I don't know, but you know, they got pretty friendly, and they still come through the yard once in a while. But I got a kick out of that. I noticed we don't have any rabbits anymore, but I think I know who's been getting them. Yeah, you know, I find the Russians have no problem finding pollen. I'm amazed. You know, we see, even last fall, we had a terrible dearth here, bad drought all summer, and in the fall, we did not put up honey. It was one of the first times in 20 years that we were really heavily feeding our bees in the fall with syrup. But you know what? They were just frame after frame of pollen. So they found pollen and they were packing that in just fine. We didn't have to worry about that. You know, one of the things I should add is that there's some new studies. If you read Bee Culture, Jay Evans last month wrote about a couple of studies done in the Dakotas. And one of the things that would be very nice to get somebody to develop is a simple test that we can test the fat levels of our winter bees, because they found that the direct connection, testing lipids and what else, amino acids, all these different things they tested in the fall to see the bees that survived and were strongest in the spring were the ones with the high levels of fat in their bodies. And so it might be time we learned how to do a simple measurement of that as an indicator that your bees are up to what they need as far as their nutrition.
Couple of related questions we kind of talked about earlier, but if you could revisit this. One asked, are the Russian bees very aggressive? And in a related question, someone asked, can you explain the difference between a pure Russian and a hybrid Russian?
Okay. Yeah. First, the second one's easiest. When we talk pure Russians, we're talking about Russians that come out of a controlled mating situation. In other words, we are mating our pure Russian queens with pure Russian drones. Okay. And those all come from our program, so we know what they are. And because all of our bees have to be tested by the lab, they confirm we've done what we're supposed to. There's a lot of things they look for. The other question was temperament. Well, let me talk a minute about what I know most bees do. And I always get that. I'll hear people say Russians are kind of hard to work, aren't they? Kind of nasty. And yeah, there's times when I've had hot hives, but I've had plenty of hot Italian hives in my life too. And I don't think you can sort of judge the whole race or type of bee based on one bad experience. So if you happen to be somebody who has one or two hives in the backyard and you have a really nasty hive, that might be your reference. But if you work 1,000 of them like we do, we have certain ones in the bee yard where we flip coins to see who does that one. But but they aren't all that way. And we also know that we don't do that one first. We do it last, because you get that one stirred up, it tends to stir up the one next to it and the one after that, and pretty soon you got a mess. So, but I would tell you this about the Russians, and I think this is maybe less true with other bees, but it's clearly true. We see you get a storm coming in over the mountains. The bees seem to sense that earlier, and I notice that they get kind of cranky when the weather shifts. I don't know whether it's barometric pressure or what, but I swear they're temperamental about the weather. If you go out and approach Russian bees this time of year after a long winter, but I think the Italians do this too, they tend to not like seeing you there. So you gotta, once they start working and getting busy, they get a lot easier to handle. And I would tell you that during the dearths, I teach a bee class to new beekeepers. And I've always told them that during July, when the dearth starts, just leave your bees alone for that 3-4 weeks. Don't bother them, because they're going to all be cranky during the dearth. And so the Russians are no different either. So, but if you work Russians mid-May to the end of June, I guarantee you, around here with the nectar flow on through that period, you'll find they're pretty easy to handle. Now, by August, they can be just huge. And, we all know once a hive is a certain size, you better dress for the occasion and light the smoker, because you will need to put a little control on that beehive. And, but there are certain conditions. Weather really plays a role in it. The other thing I would tell you to get back to the hybrid question is that I would tell you that the drones carry the defensive genes, and the defensive genes from an unknown drone that you may have a queen mate with, you may get a cross there that just isn't a nice bee, and that'll happen. So, because I've seen perfectly good hybrid Russian bees that seem to do very well, and they're quiet and they're gentle and they seem to produce, and people like them. So I'm not going to say they aren't good bees, but sometimes you get those crosses, I see that up here. We will sell somebody a nuke with a Russian queen, and the nuke will get to the point where it swarms. And once it swarms, of course, the bees replace the queen with a daughter from that original queen who's probably fine. She goes off and mates, and then all of a sudden that next generation is much more temperamental and defensive. And of course, you get the question, you know, they think they're African bees, Dan. No, I don't think they're African bees. But, you know, you get those kind of questions. But I have seen plenty of those that were kind of ugly bees to work, for sure. And they weren't as nice as the original queen. It's one of those things that happens. What else was I going to say? There was the other thing I was going to say about Russian bees, and I think this is actually somewhat true because we see it quite frequently when we will place queen cells. We requeen a lot of things with queen cells because obviously that's easier for us. But the first round of bees, of brood being laid, the first round of eggs and brood being laid in a new hive with a Russian queen, you sometimes see an overly defensive colony when they're small. And, you know, we used to think there was something going on. As soon as the first bees start to hatch from that bee, they mellow out. So it's like that first generation, it's almost like the workers know that they are particularly vulnerable and they don't want to be messed with. And that's just my theory, by the way. It's not, I don't know of any studies on that one, but I think if you work with these bees, you'll find that's actually true. So I would encourage people who are requeening and stuff, if your hive has not got brood in it, put some brood in it, which will calm them down. And I think it is a function of the brood pheromones lacking in the hive. I think once the brood pheromones are there, everybody settles down. So you will see that.
Great. Here's a good question. It says, without being in a drone-saturated area, it seems unrealistic to keep Russians going without consistently buying queens. Is that true? Would you agree with that?
Well, no, not really. You're still going to have Russian bees. They're going to dilute out over time if you don't have any Russian drones. But what do you do anytime you buy a queen? It's the same thing. You know, you lose the original queen, it's going to change. I think, you know, it's you're not going to have the purity, but you don't necessarily need the purity. You know, let me back it up a little bit and say, you know, we get in the breeders program, we get a little obsessed about purity in these bees and keeping the lines separate and distinct. However, for most of you, that isn't important. You just want a bee that produces and you can work with and doesn't die every winter, right? I mean, you don't need it to be necessarily a purebred. We're looking at these bees in a different way. A good example, I will tell you that, you know, when one of our members, he retired a couple of years back, he had one of those original lines, and it truly was a nasty bee. It was like nobody else wanted to keep it, except for one thing about it. The thing never had mites, never got sick, and always lived. But they were ornery bees, and they were hard to work. So when he was going to retire, I won't tell you about his speech, but he basically said we should pinch every one of those so-and-so queens and get rid of that line altogether, because I don't think they're worth keeping. And we all went, don't do that, don't do that. And we drew straws, see what's going to take those bees on, because we all knew as breeders, you didn't want to lose the other stuff that bee carried. You don't want to lose that. But would we sell that to a beekeeper that keeps it in the backyard and has kids around? No, not at all. That's something you want to keep out in the back country somewhere, away from people. And what we did, I felt that one of the members from New York took it on, and he crossed it with some of the gentler lines and toned it right down. But it still had a lot of the same characteristics. It still didn't seem to had a really high mite resistance, had a lot of disease resistance. And I still have some of those bees. And that was from a few years back. And those lines are actually very nice now, and they are easy to keep going. So, so we would look at that differently, is what I'm saying. You might want to get rid of it because it's an ugly bee, but we're gonna see it for the value it has if we can cross it in the right way.
Is it true with the Russians like it is with other bees that the meaner bees are generally the better producers?
I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay.
I wouldn't. I don't think that's necessarily true. A lot of times it seems that way, but I haven't seen that here. I mean, some bees are just busier. I would tell you this, the studies show that Russian bees actually make more flights in their lifetime than other bees do. One of the phenomenons I would tell you, if you're keeping Russian bees, two things you're going to notice. In the spring, there will be more brood once they kick in. Then it seems there are bees to cover that brood, and you wonder, how do they keep that brood warm? Seriously. Or how do they feed that brood? You will be looking, saying, there's not enough bees in this hive to support those frames. And up here, we're still getting chilly nights and stuff. And yet they all hatch out and they all do their thing and they get big. So you see that. That's one of the phenomena. And the other thing is they will actually outproduce on honey with seemingly fewer bees. And we've always wondered how they do that. But the studies that just came out on that was they fly more flights per day, each individual. And so in their lifetime, I forget what the exact numbers were, but it was substantial for each bee. They basically did another 25%, nectar movement. So,
wow.
So they have some characteristics. We see with the apple growers like our bees because they actually do fly when it's cool in the morning. About 10 degrees cooler, they will go out and start pollinating ahead of other types of bees. When I first started putting Russians out on the apple growers, and of course all these guys have meetings like beekeepers do, and they all talk to each other. The guys who were getting the Italian bees started bugging me, saying, "How come I don't get some of those dark bees like Al's getting over there? His bees are pollinating and mine aren't. What's wrong there?" So everybody had to get dark bees after that.
Someone who has Russian bees is asking if he can get his bees tested to see how pure the Russian genetics are.
He probably could, but he's probably he or she. I'm not sure who we're talking to, but probably. Yeah, we've had the lab do that on occasion. The problem is the lab hasn't been working since COVID. And I don't know when they're going to catch up. For example, they're sitting on all of our members' queen samples right now. We won't probably have our samples approved until after we're well into the season. So we're really operating on the last known stocks that passed, But I would tell him or her, if it's important to them, they could probably contact Lilia de Guzman at the Bee Lab and just ask, I know that we've done that with people in the past, but it's not my decision. But Lilia is a good person. She would certainly follow up for whoever is interested.
And that's the lab in Baton Rouge?
Baton Rouge lab, yeah. They're the only ones who do it. They developed all these tests. They're the only ones who do it.
Great. Are the foundation cell sizes smaller for Russians versus Italians, the same or larger?
What was that? Cell size? No, they're the same.
Foundation cell size, the same?
Same, yeah. We, we use pretty much standard equipment and standard comb. And, I'll tell you a quick story. Probably 15 years back or so, I had this problem with queens mating, but they would be sterile. and I couldn't figure out what was going on, and it was kind of troubling. You know, you'd sell somebody a queen that looked great, and it'd be a drone layer, and you'd kind of go, boy, that's crazy. Then, but you know, I do have a lab here, so I do some of my own lab work, and I started dissecting them and looking at the spermatheca, and I realized they were being mated. They were mated. They had the clearly the spermatheca was cloudy. It was you know, there was semen there, and finally, I think it was Dewey Karen or somebody like that was visiting, and I started talking to him about that, and he said, you know, did you ever use, you know, what was the mite treatment? Which, by the way, I never did. And long story short, I sent it down to the lab in Beltsville, and they checked the wax, and they found very low levels of coumaphos in the wax. Now, I've never ever used it in my operation. So how it got there, but here's what I found out, and this was confirmed I think it was Paul Kelly or one of those guys in Canada. Basically, they found out that small amounts of coumaphos with drones makes the drone sterile, so they can still mate. It's just not going to do anything. And so from that day on, we stopped using wax that was purchased on the open market. And we went to plastic foundation, and haven't had a problem since. So I have to say, I think it came in on one of the batches of commercially sold wax. So that made me skeptical. And by the way, most people would tell you I've always been sort of a wax and wood kind of beekeeper, but that kind of switched me over. So just a quick story, you know, whether anecdotal, I know, but I think it probably was worth doing. So I know what kind of wax is on that foundation now.
Here's a comment. Someone said the yellow line they got 3 years ago, they were very calm.
Okay, good to hear that.
What differences are there between Russians and other bees with regard to queen rearing?
Oh, okay. I don't know that we do anything particularly different. I mean, our method is kind of the old Doolittle style. We graft from day-old larvae, and we use finishers and starters and finishers, and then we have mating nukes that we move the cells to. But I don't think we do anything particularly different. I think it's pretty standard stuff as far as the queen rearing. I mean, we're careful to make sure we're using healthy bees. We're careful to feed those bees, those colonies, so they're good and strong. Make sure they have plenty of pollen and food on them. And other than that, I don't think anything we're doing is particularly different from what other queen producers would be doing.
Understood. If anybody else has any questions, please go ahead and enter them in the chat box. I think we're winding down here. I did want to mention, you mentioned mite biters. Do you think that the Purdue mite biter line, to your knowledge, do they have any Russian bloodlines in that Purdue mite biter bee?
I don't. They could. I mean, I know the Saskatraz queens that everybody was trying out. They probably still are. Those are based on the Russian stock that we gave him years ago, or the lab gave him years ago. That's where they got the mite tolerance from. And of course, you know, he's added stuff to that with other combinations. So a lot of these bees that are doing pretty well with the mites do have some Russian in them. That's why you're one of the other earlier questions about, you know, not being able to maintain a Russian if you're using it isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's another type of thinking about all of this, and that is more diversity in your genetics, in your drone genetics, actually contributes to better health in your hive. In other words, we're using a closed system where we're trying to control those drones and who mates with our queens. But just as good is to make sure, if you aren't doing that, have a variety of different genetic stock in your bee yard, so you've got a variety of drones. The work Dave Tarpey did on that few years back really opened everybody's eyes on the fact that the more diverse lines mating with one queen, the better the hive looks and the better the hive performs. So that should be your goal too. So it's more that you would do better. It doesn't matter if you don't have the Russian drones, but if you have a variety of different bees in your area, then you probably will still get good performance out of that next generation.
Right. I don't see any more questions. Let me put you on the spot here. If say Chip Kelly wanted some Russian queens, how would he go about getting them? Would he look at the listings on the Russian Breeders Org website?
Yeah, I would say that. We start having queens up north here in June usually, a little later than a lot of people want them, but that's when we usually have. We like to sell proven queens. In other words, we want them to come out of a nuke that's been laying for a while, so I don't have any questions about what I'm sending you. We, you ever know a guy, Dana Stallman from Ohio?
Yes, I've seen a recent webinar.
Well, Dana in the old days, when I was a kid or younger, he would guarantee all his queens, no questions asked, right? Now, who does that? Who can do that, right? So I had never met Dana, and one year we had him in Massachusetts, and he did a talk at the state meeting, and I had a chance to have dinner with him. And I said, Dana, tell me how you did that. How could you possibly always send people a really good queen? And he says because I got rid of all the ones that weren't any good and only sent the good ones. I said, that's too simple. But you know what? He's right. When I started producing lots of queens, I realized the real key to quality queens is simply this. Besides the basics of doing it right when you're raising them, it's culling out at each step what's not good. When you graft, the first thing you see a day after they've been in a starter is they reject certain cups. You damage the larvae or something, and they damage it. So the bees reject that. So they call that for you. And then you'll see the ones they'll start drawing down. You put them in the finisher, and then you go in and look for the development. And what you'll see is some really nice, long, fat-looking cells, and that's the ones you want. And then you'll see some little runty cells. But the real key is just get rid of those runty cells right there. So at each step, there's a culling process, where you can actually, so you might start, the thing is you might start with 100 grafts, but you might end up with a percentage of 50 that are really good queens in the end. But, you can't be afraid to cull if you want quality. That's the trick. And so if you talk to guys who graft and raise queens, they talk in terms of percentages. Oh, I had an 80% take, meaning I had 80% of my grafts the bees took. They liked them, right? That's really good. That's a real high percentage in this game. I had a nephew who didn't know anything, worked for me in the summers. Hell, he would get 95, 100% of his grafts would take all the time. I kept thinking, how do you do that? I can't do that. I've never been that good at it. So, it's sort of a combination of skill, but also you have to be a little bit ruthless if you want to have high quality bees.
I don't see any more questions. I just want to express my appreciation for you being with us this evening. I am always love to learn new things, and this subject really hit the spot with me. I appreciate you taking your time to speak with us.
I appreciate being invited, Chip. I hope people got something out of it. I know it's not a topic for everybody, but I think it's a good thing to understand as much as what you can. And I might have stepped a little bit out of my expertise on some of these, but it's always a learning curve. I hope we learn something every day, you know.
That's true, and I don't think it may not be for everybody, but it's for anybody who wants to learn. I think we'll all probably encounter Russian bees at some point, so
yeah,
it's good to know about them.
Well, the only thing I regret about this is, you know, I get these Zoom meetings are a little odd. I kind of like the old style of being in the room with everybody.
That's true, but you know, we couldn't afford to have brought you down to Tennessee to speak to us.
Well, that's true.
And this has been a real blessing to us, you know, as a bee club.
Yeah, well, you know, I'll be traveling down that way next month to Mississippi, so we go through Tennessee quite a bit, probably 3-4 times a year.
We'll stay in touch when this COVID stuff ends. We'll
yeah.
pick you up on a Monday night.
Yeah, no, and hey, you know, it's you know, I got to sleep somewhere. I'll just sleep where the meeting is. That's all. Anyway, thank you guys, and thanks everybody for tuning in and listening.
Well, thank you.